8. Well, yesterday the Greek Parliament passed some very controversial deals to bail out the country. Yes, the International Monetary Fund and the European Union handing over money to Greece so that they can pay their debts. But of course, lots of protests in the streets as well. In fact, parts of Athens were ablaze yesterday. And to talk with us more about this, the business editor at New Zealand Herald, Dann, is with us. Good morning, Liam.
G'day, how's it going?
Very good, thanks. Could you just give us a wee primer and get us up to play with why Greece is in the situation it's in now?
Yeah, well, I guess it's a combination of the global financial crisis and the way they've the way they've run the country since they got into the Eurozone or adopted the European currency in 2000. It's emerged they sort of were fudging their books just to get in the first place, and since then I guess they've had a fairly lackluster economy, and then they've borrowed their way through that. They've fudged the books again a bit on things like they produce olive oil. They get subsidies from the EU for olive oil production. Turns out that they were producing far less than they were claiming, so they could get bigger subsidies, things like that. They were covering the gaps with borrowing from European banks and other European countries as well.
But can the blame be put squarely on the authorities in Greece?
Oh, I think you've got to share the blame. I mean, the people who lend the money have some responsibility too to know where they're lending their money. I mean, but in the end, when you borrow money, it comes back to you, whether you've, at least in the system we've got. So sort of from a legal perspective and from an economic perspective, it comes back to the government of Greece, and that I guess comes back to the people of Greece, who obviously, as we saw yesterday, aren't very happy about it.
Now, there was a bailout last year, wasn't there?
Yeah, it turned out, I think it was 145 billion euros. Basically, it turned out it wasn't big enough, so that's the problem. They're looking at about another 170 billion they need to avoid default, and they have to. This is all bond debt, bonds that have been sold to private banks, and they have to be in a deal that's been done with all the euro leaders and all the private banks. They've agreed how much they'll write down, which is about 50%, and they have to swap these bonds out for bonds that are worth less, and that has to happen by about March 14, and I gather the whole process is just so complex, so that means that there's a series of really important deadlines starting pretty much now or yesterday with this bill of austerity measures, which the European leaders, countries like Germany, just really demand that Greece takes this action, otherwise they're not going to lend them the money, because they feel, and the people in the countries like Germany feel sick of what they perceive as the Greeks sort of getting a bit of a free ride, I guess.
And it's these, of course, austerity measures that people were out protesting about yesterday. I mean, how bad are these measures for the people of Greece?
Yeah, pretty serious. You've already got an economy that's in a serious recession going back. I think it shrank by 5% in the last quarter. So it's already going backwards. Then on top of that, these measures would see about 20% of civil servant jobs go. It's about 15,000 jobs there. The minimum wage would be lowered by 20%, and they're pretty much looking at some fairly severe labour law reforms, sort of busting the unions type stuff, I guess. So that's going to, as well as the people directly affected by jobs and minimum wages and so on, it's going to, in the short term, the trouble is you get into the cycle where those sort of measures actually make the economy worse. It'll shrink harder and faster.
So what's the point then?
Well, the point is that if, and their finance minister was talking about this yesterday, the argument that the government's putting before the people is that if we don't do this, we just won't be able to pay the wages of any civil servants, and we'll be completely bankrupt. And, they're presenting it as that severe. I guess countries have defaulted before. Argentina defaulted in the 90s and things, and they do survive, but it's pretty severe, and Europe can't cope with, and the world can't cope with Greece defaulting. Those is one of the problems.
Right. Is it not that the Greek people can't cope with it? It's because people outside can't cope with it?
Well, yeah, there's a good debate about that as to whether it's better to take a short, sharp shock and actually let it go.
Yeah.
If it went, though, then all that European money would have to be directed towards probably bailing out European banks that started falling over instead of bailing out Greece, and also the cost of borrowing in Europe would rise so high that countries like Italy and Spain, which are already a bit shaky, would suddenly have a lot of trouble getting money to fund their debts, so they'd be at risk of default. And if you have a Spain or an Italy starting to default, then you've got some really serious financial problems, and you've really got a global financial crisis for the whole world again. So we're back to 2008. So it's fairly high stakes that they get this right, and certainly the European leaders see it that way.
So a key indicator for the welfare of the people of Greece is the employment figures. Now they're hovering around 20% unemployment at the moment. Has anyone run the figures to say, well, if they did default, how far out unemployment would blow out? Would it be much worse than it is now, or not?
Look, I'm not sure, but I imagine it would get worse in the short term. That would be the thing about a default, that the country would get worse in the short term. But what would happen is if it defaulted and if it left the euro, it could switch to back to a drachma or something, and it could let its currency fall, which is what saves countries when they default or when they get into trouble. It would save New Zealand if our economy collapsed. Our dollar would drop really sharply, and all of a sudden our exports would be cheaper to the rest of the world, and people could buy more of them, and we'd get more currency. The trouble for Greece is because they're in the euro, in the eurozone, they can't do that. They're stuck with this euro, which has fallen a lot, but is still pretty strong based on the strength of the German economy and the French economy. So they're in a bind, and that's where people get to this point where they say there's a structural flaw in the European system, which they are not necessarily addressing just by bailing them out as they go. I mean, this could all work. Greece could get bailed out, and we could still be facing further issues with Spain or Italy down the track. So,
so politically, isn't this an issue for Greece as well, where the leaders, the politicians there, aren't actually in control of their own country?
Well, it's weird. They've sort of got an undemocratic government at the moment. They've got a central banker in charge. They put in, basically when things went to the brink late last year, they put in a coalition government was formed. So you've got socialists and conservatives who have put together a government which has the sole aim of avoiding default and getting through this process. So they are promised elections in April, but that's it'll all effectively be a done deal by then. So I guess that's where the frustration from the people comes, that this isn't the Prime Minister that they elected. It's like putting Alan Bollard in charge, basically, because you're in so much trouble.
The CEO's in charge.
Yeah. That's it. And they're told that they just have to lump it for now.
Liam Dann from the New Zealand Herald, business editor. Thanks very much for your time on this issue. Cheers.
Cheers, Liam.
Time now here on Kiwi is 18 minutes past 8. Good track here from Catch.